ISO TC211 good practice. It started off with the exciting part of having our resolutions on the web, and we have actually taken a little bit more than 1,000 resolutions or something like that. So it's a lot of resolutions in here, and you can find them all and things like that. But how do you know which of them are the important one? How do you know which of them it affects the way we work when we are producing our standards in TC211? That was not so clear by having them in a long row on the web page. So that's where the idea started of pulling them together into something that we didn't have a name for, but that became the ISO TC211 good practices. Quite early in that process, we came to the conclusion that it's not that easy to understand all of our resolutions by themselves if they are not also in connection with the ISO directives. Now the ISO directives is very long and a lot of information as well. So we tried to then combine the resolutions we had that affected the way we work with the perhaps a light version of what the ISO directives tells us that we need to do in certain steps of the process. This then became the bigger idea, the bigger scope of the ISO TC211 good practices. But again, by that account, we also have a lot of standing documents, the N documents in ISO documents that have a lot of useful information that also talks about and discuss how do we work and the things we need to do in certain steps and things like that. So then we started to incorporate those kind of things as well into the TC211 good practices. So this has now become a thing of its own, so to say. So we've actually now have started also to, rather than producing separate things, said that this would then come into the good practice. So it's taken on a little life of its own. It started with that small scope, but now have grown to something bigger. And to answer the most asked question already now, when will it be completed? I don't think we will ever see the end of it. It will always be updated and added and removed stuff in the good practices, because the world is changing and we change with the world, and then also the good practice needs to change to reflect what we're doing. So that was a little bit of the background of the good practice. Where do you find the good practice? Well, you find it on our TC web. Now it's perhaps a little bit more understanding why it started under the resolutions, because that was the intention first. But since it's now been used that much, we have also put a placeholder in the top navigation as well for the good practices. So you come to the same start page from both of them. And how do you navigate? How do you look at the good practice? Well, we have a navigation out on the left. This is a little bit decided by the tool itself, the web pages that we are using from ISO to host our website. So that's why the fonts are the way they are, the sizes are the way they are, and that the navigation is on your right rather than on your left. that you can see on other web pages. So we had to adapt a little bit to the tool we are using. We have a part in the beginning called overall procedures, where we have tried to put in things that are of a character that are perhaps a little bit more general in its nature. We do have a lot of support systems. We have areas where we find other useful material. So we try to write a little bit about them and also giving the links to where they are. We did also then find ourselves in the situation that we had this resource page earlier. And that it's a good page, and we do want to have that page, but it should also be in our good practice page as well. So we added a link to that as well, the resources page and under support system. Then we come to maybe where we saw where we had most questions to the Secretariat, and that has to do with the creation of standards, with how we work with managing the document process for standards. So we have dedicated quite a lot of space here in the good practice about the different stages, how to work with the documents, how to think, and how to communicate around them. And here's we might see more perhaps of what we have borrowed in from the directives, but also what we have as separate resolutions from our TC, that and how they mix with each other. Then, of course, there's the reason why we're here is to write standards. There is some questions about how do we actually produce the document itself, not just the document process in the different stages, but what do we add into the document? When do I add things? How does this with editing committees work and stuff like that? All those kind of things that we get a lot of questions. And again, this is not saying that you should stop asking questions. I thrive on questions. I think that's the best way of getting knowledge, is to ask a lot of questions. And with that, I like to answer a lot of questions. So you're more than happy to continue to ask me, but see this as a resource of also getting knowledge of where to find things. And then we have a few of these that we were maybe not really sure on where to place. And again, this is maybe not the final structure that we will have, but they are placed here right now, and that's the URA structures, for instance, and also the part that ISO told us would not fit into the amendment of 19135 part 1 that we also then set up in here. We're ending to coming back to maybe the thing that we started to have the good practice for, which is how to know which are of the resolutions that we have taken have we referenced in this material. So here is just a list of what you find in all of the good practice. But let's go a little bit more into details and talk a little bit about the different areas in the good practice. The overall procedures. We have participation. How do you become a part of the work? Important again to talk about those kind of things of we have to be registered in the ISO Global Directory to be able to access the correct documents, to be able to be invited to the correct meetings and stuff like that. But it's always not so simple to figure out how this is done. So we've tried to note down the information that could be needed to solve this part. Also a little bit about expectations. What's expected of me when I come in and want to be a part of ISO TC211. That ties into the next part, the next page here, which we have called the roles in the committee. And here we can see if I'm a delegate or if I'm a convener or if I'm an editor or I'm part of the project team, all those kind of, again, where we got questions to the Secretariat and know that there are maybe not so easy to understand. For instance, project team, there is nothing in ISO directives talking about project teams. Project teams is something that we have adapted for ISO TC211 because we have working groups that are working with more than one standard. The ISO itself counts a working group to contain one standard, but you know all that's not how we're doing it in TC211. So we needed to break down a working group into smaller parts, and we call that the project team. But that's not so easy to understand if you come from another TC and want to join TC211 and how are we doing things in here. But again, we're not the only TC who's doing it this way. There are other TCs working exactly as we are doing. So even though we haven't maybe invented this part ourselves, it could still be good to have it noted down somewhere so you can go and verify this and check on what's the intention of a project team and things like that. We have a lot of liaisons with both ISO TCs, but perhaps more important in some ways are liaison organizations out there, which we work together with in many of our projects. And just again, what's good to know about the relationships from liaisons, and the most important part here is perhaps the dedicated person that we have named to be our liaison representative from our side. If you take on that role, you have a little bit more work that we expect you to do. But again, it's not so easily defined elsewhere to find on how should I do it and what should I do and when should I do it. So again, this is to maybe highlight this a little bit easier. We're taking a lot of decisions. We are taking decisions by resolution. We are taking decisions by ballot. We call them committee internal ballot resolutions when they are of the more important character. We do send out ballots for other things, comments and stuff like that. But it's again, perhaps a good thing for the new person coming in or the person that wants to understand why are we taking a decision about one thing and not the other thing. And we have tried to note down all the different scenarios that we think we are taking decisions about. And it's quite complex actually to understand all of these things. But again, we're not saying that this is 100% the truth of everything and will be so in the future as well. This is what we are understanding right now and have noted down, but there could be changes, there could be improvements, and we are happy to have you read and come with suggestions of things that are hard to understand or things that are difficult or not in the good practice that we could add in there. Maybe I should have said this from the start. The Program Maintenance Group, the PMG, was given the task of being what do you call it? The editor in charge of the good practice. So all changes are canalized, are channeled into the PMG conveners decision making. But then again, we have several of the pages containing information about the specific area. And of course, then it's not the PMG who decides on if a procedure or process is done in a certain way. That's being decided by the people who knows the best. Then it's a little bit complicated because everything that needs updating needs to go through the Secretariat and being updated. But we try to be very responsive on those kind of changes as well. Vienna Agreement, there are always a few questions. We have taken the strategy to work in collaborative with the European standardization, CEN, and have all of our standards covered by the Vienna Agreement. So that means that all of our ISO standards is also becoming EN ISO standards in the end. And that's a little bit information about those kind of things. Supporting systems, ISO documents, ISO meetings, ISO projects, these are ISO tools, but we also have that page that I mentioned earlier, the resource links, linking to things like the terminology pages on GitHub and the HMMG wikis and stuff like that. So that's perhaps also a very useful page to look at. We do have the famous standard tracker that has also in the last year changed its appearance and are now situated in GitHub and managed by PMG. So if you come across any problem with any of our standards, here is a possibility to note this down so we don't forget to come back to that problem when we do a revision of the standard. Or this could also be the reason why we would start a revision, that we have so much information in the standards tracker. How do a project start? Who is allowed to put in a project into TC211? When does it become a part of the program of work, and all those kind of questions? We're trying to explain those kind of things, both with the ways to get started, but also a little bit in the preliminary work item stage, because you could actually start an item with a pre-study of the subject. So the famous ISO clock does not start ticking you down on timing that you need to actually create the documents. You can then, of course, have a time before starting that clock. That's called a preliminary work item for people who has been with us in TC211 for a long time know that we used to call this a stage 0 project, but we have modified that title to be more in line with how ISO is classifying our projects. So it's the same thing, but named now a PVI rather than a stage 0 project. Then when it comes to a proposal, we have resolutions about sending out a new proposal for a 30-day comment before we go for the new project ballot, the NP ballot. This is maybe something that when I came into TC211, I had a big problem with understanding when did we do this? When did we send out things on that 30-day comment, and when did we not? And dependent who I asked in the committee, I've got several different answers. And to me, and not the least to Agneta, who's also been heavily involved in creating this good practice, getting the different answer from several people means that we are not really sure on when we do things and how we should do it. So again, we have noted down what we think is the most optimal solution of everybody's opinion. That does not mean that this cannot be changed in the future, but this is how we are treating our projects right now, and how the document process starts. We should also remember that even if we take a lot of resolutions, we can never take a resolution that is contradicting the ISO directives. So in first hand, we have to live up to the ISO directives, and then we can add our special resolutions on how we want to manage it even more than the directives. But we can't do anything that contradicts the ISO directives. Then we have one page for each stage in the document life cycle. It actually have a stage name, even though we often refer to it as the working draft or the CD or the DIS. It's then rather than just having what we are maybe a little bit sloppy with naming our in everyday talk, we added those real name of the stages where the documents are situated. This of course also correspond to the numbering system that ISO have on the document. So if you have been in the project and looking at the project, you would see that there's 4 digits naming where a document is placed. So when it is in preliminary stage, the PVI, it's usually either at 00.00 or 00.20, a little bit depending on how we note the project into ISO. And when it comes to the committee stage, when you are doing most of the work, you are mostly in the stage of 30.20. But when you are almost on the brink of going to the DIS, you come up to 30.99 and stuff like that. So there's a lot of different ways of explaining this cycle, but what we thought in the good practice is maybe not to complicate and having all of those stages. You can find them on the program of work on the project page here, but not in the good practice. Again, what should I do? The pages in the document process are try to be built in the same way. So we're explaining a little bit of the part that we are in, the ballot that is coming, how we should or should not address comments, things like the extra resolutions that we have taken, that we need to verify the harmonized model, the XML schemas, the terminologies before we go for a DIS ballot and so on. So all this information are structured in the process of the document life cycle. So you can actually then, depending on where you are in your project, go in and read about, I'm here now, I'm going there, what do I need to do to be able to get there? There is this mystical final draft international standard that's coming in some of the processes, but not all. And that is when you have an editorial change on the DIS document itself. And then we go to the final draft international standard, an extra ballot. But if we do not have that, we would go directly to the publication. And that's also something that people tend to ask some questions to the Secretariat about. Systematic reviews are maybe difficult in themselves, so we are trying to explain a lot about systematic reviews. We are also perhaps in already next week coming with a little bit more information, also connected to the PMG recommendations with systematic reviews. So I hope I will have something on next Friday to show you who would attend the plenary meeting on what we are doing there. Then, of course, what's happening in the document, the content of the document, about the figures. This is maybe the thing we have struggled most with during my time in the Secretariat, trying to get ISO to accept that we are writing our UML figures, and they should not have those as revisable formats and doing translations in the figures, and with that destroying the idea of having the UMLs as they are. So we have now gotten them to accept them as PNG files. But for all other files or all other figures, there are rules that says that we are only allowed to submit them in certain formats. And a DIS could be delayed if we do not do this. So it's a very important part for us in the Secretariat to verify this before we do the submission. That's why I may sometimes be a little bit headstrong in my dialogue with a project leader for a project, that you actually need to submit all the things I need to be able to convince ISO that we are going for DIS on things like that. But again, it's much easier if you already know that to begin with, rather than it's coming as a surprise the same week that you think you are submitting your document for DIS. A little bit more, editing committees is also one of the questions of who is part of an editing committee, who takes decision, and what is the decision that is made. We have a few resolutions talking about this, and we do have the editing committee meetings after the CD ballot and the DIS ballot, and you can read a little bit more about that here as well.